As you can see, I'm drinking from this week's commemorative mug. It's a beauty. I have to say, I'm very proud of this one. Next week, I'm getting better and better. Next week, I've gone two-tone. I actually ordered a two-tone one for Mark Peterson. But Professor DeLucia and Professor Blatt, I gave you a slight taste of what this is. But what we're doing is, the students, it's a weird year. There's 100 of them living in a hotel, and we don't get to see each other the way I would like. So sort of community building exercise for each of these classes where we have guests, I'm making a commemorative mug. So this week's I have, it says King Philip's War in History. How do we get it? King Philip's War in History and Memory, and it has your names on it. Who knows what that is? You guys should get that easily.
That's amazing.
Pardon?
That's amazing. Thank you.
Well, so Professor Blatt, I hand delivered on my way home for my son's hockey game in Woburn on the weekend. It's a really wonderful place. But Marty, you're not drinking from it?
Well, I have been. Not
now.
I had
That's why I brought it for you on the weekend, so you can be drinking from it. So wait, who knows what this is, though?
Well, it's a little hard to see.
You guys can't see it? It's Deer Island. I took the photo myself. I took my kids a few weeks ago to Castle Island, which faces Deer Island. They had a great time, and I said I am going to take a photo for my mug, and I did it. And on the back, we have a famous image of William Apis, right? So Professor Blatt has his. This is Professor DeLucia's. This is going to go in the mail. Get it to her on time. And for you guys, ooh, styling. So I got a styling in the chat. For you guys, as you know, you're going to answer a question. Professor Blatt's going to ask you the challenge question at the end of class, and you email me your answers, correct answers. And if we have more than one correct answer, we'll have a face-off at the beginning of next class for who gets the commemorative mug. The coffee is so much better out of a commemorative mug. Okay, so we're ready to roll. And this week we are really, really lucky because we have two really, really wonderful experts on this topic joining us, including the public historian who's put together commemorative events related to what we're going to talk about, and one of the foremost historian of the topic whose work we are reading. So what we're going to do is I'll give the introduction, since we're all together now, to tell you who Marty and Christine are, and then Professor Blatt will talk a little bit about some of the events he's been involved in and their significance to our class. And then I'm going to have the two experts speak to one another. And he's going to talk with Professor DeLucia about her work and about the topic. So what we'll do, and we'll leave time for questions. So what we'll do is I'll monitor the chat. So if there's something you don't understand, something really pressing, by all means, jump in and I'll interrupt on your behalf if you're not understanding something. But otherwise, we'll take questions at the end and I'll ask them through the chat, or if you want to ask directly, you can write RTS, request to speak, no problem, we'll have a conversation. So Marty Blatt, Professor Blatt, he really is one of this country's foremost public historians. He worked for the National Park Service for decades before coming to Northeastern to be the director of the public history program. He has coordinated, organized, written countless numbers of exhibits and really historically and socially conscious exhibits. And this year, he won essentially public history's version of the Oscars Lifetime Achievement Award. It is called it's the Robert M. Kelly Memorial Award by the National Council on Public History. And I'm really not joking. This is like the Nobel for Public History, or like I said, the Lifetime Achievement Award for the Oscars, really only given to the country's foremost public historians for their contribution over the course of a career. And Christine DeLucia teaches at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. She taught for a long time at Mount Holyoke first, before making the move slightly northwest. And she teaches Native American and Indigenous history, as well as on early America, a whole host of topics. And her book, which you read a good chunk of, Memory Lands, King Philip's War and the Place of Violence in the Northeast, won a slew of awards, pretty much everyone you can win, 4, I believe, precisely. So I'm just going to mention one right now, which is the Lois Rudnick Prize for the best book about New England, or by a New England historian, which is given over 2 years. So it's over the course of 2 years, the best book about New England. So this is a really serious prize. And so I make you read good stuff, right? And I bring you the authors themselves. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Marty. Marty, do I need to make you, are you going to screen share at all? Do I need to make you a co-host, or I will anyway?
Well,
you have capabilities now.
Your questions are already exceeding my my capacity with Zoom.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm here, and I see all these little boxes. So I think
I had to ask. So it doesn't matter. We have equal capabilities now, but you don't have to do anything with it.
Okay, I probably won't. And I want to begin. I want to thank you for inviting me and for your very kind introduction. And note that public history is a collaborative effort, and so I was quite honored to receive that prize from the National Council on Public History, and I could not have earned that without the collaboration with many other public historians and scholars and social justice activists. At any rate, thanks for the kind invitation, and thanks very much to my colleague Christine DeLucia for joining us this morning. And I, looking around the squares, I wish I were looking around the room, but here we are. I wanted to say hi to Deborah Lavelle, who a recognizable face on a square. So I wanted to say good morning.
Hi, Marty.
Hi. And just so for technical issues, I'm in the room, the best room in my house in Cambridge for the connection. But I do get on occasion a sign on my computer saying your connection is wobbly, or whatever it is, the words to that effect. So stop me, Professor Rabinovich, if something is rendered garbled or incoherent, or if I'm freezing too much, or I may not be aware of it, but if you are, stop. I can go back.
And you can always turn off the, if the bandwidth is not good, you can turn off your video and we'll hear you. As you can hear, it's and the students are starting to learn it's garbage day in West Roxbury on Tuesdays. So they're pulling up my street right now. I'll keep mine on mute. But yeah, I'll let you know if there's any.
Okay. I mean, I'd rather have we're in such a strange world that I'd rather have the picture as small a frame as it might be. Okay, so let's get right going, and I want to start with the observation that 17th century New England experienced two devastating wars of destruction waged by the colonists against Native Americans, and the first, and you saw some of this in Professor DeLucia's book. Was the Pequot War of 1637 to 1638, which devastated that tribal community. The major conflict of that war was in Mystic, Connecticut in 1637, when Connecticut and Massachusetts militiamen slaughtered as many as 700 Pequots. And you have Massachusetts colony governor John Winthrop wrote in his journal, and I quote, "There was a day of thanksgiving kept in all the churches for the victory obtained against the Pequots," the victory which consisted of slaughter of hundreds of people. So many Pequots were killed or sold into slavery in the aftermath of the war. And you have historian Benjamin Madley, who's written about genocide against Native Americans in California, that this Pequot War was one of the earliest genocides in what would later become the United States. So later, a bit later in that century, New England experiences King Philip's War. 1675 to 76 is when most historians put the dates for that war. This was a brief but extremely violent conflict. The Wampanoags, led by Metacom, or Philip, as the British called him, joined the Narragansetts and other tribes in combat against the English and their allies. Native Americans fought this war essentially to defend greater and greater encroachments on their land and their sovereignty. And so both the Pequot War and King Philip's War should be seen, in my view, as the struggles of indigenous people against white colonial settlers intent on displacing them and relegating them to less than human status. And there's plenty of evidence of that, which we could talk about later in terms of the language that's employed. I want to focus on two particular episodes of King Philip's War briefly. In the winter of 1675 to 76, the praying Indians, so-called, these were Christianized Indians, Indians that converted to Christianity, and that has its own complicated history. At any rate, for their own protection, according to one leader of the colonists, they were arrested, moved to Deer Island, which is on the mug, as the professor said, and other islands in Boston Harbor. Hundreds died from starvation and exposure. So that's one episode that I wanted to highlight for your attention. Again, you read about it in Professor DeLucia's book. The other is Boston Common. And at the end of the war, approximately 45 Native American prisoners were brought into what was then the town, not city, the town of Boston, and publicly executed by hanging or shooting. Similar to the Pequot War, many Native Americans were killed and sold into slavery at the conclusion of this war. So I want to turn to my first encounter with King Philip's War in any depth. Prior to this encounter, I was only really vaguely aware of this history. And it's a history that I feel that Americans must know in depth and understand and engage and grapple with. All right, so in 2000, I was working for the National Park Service. I was with that agency, federal agency, for 24 years. And I organized a program called Changing Meanings of Freedom, the 225th anniversary of the American Revolution, right? This was in the year 2000. Our keynote speaker was distinguished historian Eric Foner. At that time, he had a new book called The Story of American Freedom, which holds up well if you ever want to look at it. And he did a textbook derived from that. But so what's the main thesis of that book? Basically, that the story of US history is full of conflicts and setbacks, advances sometimes towards freedom, and also movements away from freedom. Look at our lives today. You don't have to look any further than that. At any rate, that his argument is, the central thesis, that US history is not a straight line of progress towards ever greater freedom. So that was the topic of his keynote. And many people, celebrants of US history, which includes many historians, right, who should take maybe a more nuanced approach, but many historians, and of course many along of the sites on the Freedom Trail, and many around the country, do take still the approach that they would argue US history is a straight line of progress towards ever greater freedom. Things were great in the Revolutionary War, and then it's only gotten better and better ever since. So it's a very popular notion. It's wrong historically, which Foner argued, and others, but it's very popular. Well, one of the panelists that I invited was Gary Nash, who's written a lot about labor history, African-American history. And I gave, as the organizer, I gave each panelist an assignment, and virtually everyone followed their instructions except Gary, who went completely off topic. And he, but ended up in a good way. What he did was to issue a bold challenge, a very direct challenge to those who were assembled in front of him, who were the majority that we had from the audience, from the general public, but it was principally Park Service employee, practicing public historians, teachers who were getting professional development points, and so on. And he said in his talk, where was any attention to the 325th anniversary of the Native American struggle for freedom represented by King Philip's War? Where are the conferences, he asked, the public programs, the monuments, the commemorations? And his answer, of course, was nothing. It's nowhere to be found. He said, look, in his challenge, we have more than enough of talking about the struggle of white colonists against Britain. So it was stunning. And I was quite like, oh, taken aback, as were many in the audience. Some were offended. But that's great to start. He started a conversation. He stimulated arguments, exchange. And so I went, the first chance I had at a break, I went to him and I said, well, Gary, you completely went off script. You didn't address what I asked you to do. And I'm really glad you did what you did. So what I'd like to do is let's give this more life. not just have it be a one-off talk at a conference and then, life goes on. But let's approach the Boston Globe and you publish an op-ed making the arguments that you made. And he said, fine, with one condition, you be the co-author. And I said, okay, but I'm going to need to check with my superiors. And I did, and my superiors said, no, you can't do that. The argumentation went, there were a few different arguments. This would serve to embarrass the National Park Service. It was one argument. Quoting one senior Park Service official, it's hard enough to work with the Indians. We don't need this. Okay, that's more or less a direct quote. I remember it from 20 years ago because was I surprised? No. If you're a public historian, especially in the federal government, especially these days, but really in many times in history, you don't have any academic freedom. There's no concept of that. Okay, it's strictly a hierarchy. You are, if you're a subordinate, like I was, I knew enough. I have somewhat of a rebellious spirit. I did through that whole time in my working for the agency. But I knew enough that insubordination can get you fired. And that would have been considered insubordinate if I had gone ahead and published the op-ed with Gary Nash. So we were stymied. Now Nash, interestingly, was shocked by this. And I didn't say it quite as bluntly as I'm going to tell you, but I thought to myself, how can you be so shocked? To me, it revealed the extent to which he was living, and he's not alone, in the ivory tower of the academy, where you can largely say what you want and not suffer consequences and not be censored if you want. I mean, it was censorship. So I learned something. I mean, over all of my career, the years in the Park Service, one thing I tried over and over, to greater and lesser success, was to try to bring the academy together with public historians, because these still are, unfortunately, often very separate worlds that don't interact, and to the detriment of each, I would say. I said to Nash, look, let's make the best of it. Why don't you submit it on your own? He said, no, we're not doing it together, then that's it. So that was that. So much for giving that argument more of a life at that time in Boston in 2000. But I will tell you that the incident really struck me and stayed with me over several years. So fast forward from that, 2000, to my tenure at Northeastern, which was the last 6 years, when I was director of the public history program, and when I had what I call, and really do think about, as the luxury of academic freedom. So what did I do with it? I taught a course on the history and memory of King Philip's War, and Christine kindly joined us via Skype from Chicago, and she was doing research and talked about her terrific book on memory of King Philip's War. And I did multiple public presentations about the war, and mainly about, since I am not a subject matter expert. If I'm expert in anything, it's in public history. So I talked about the absence of, on the cultural landscape of Boston, the absence of King Philip's War. Where can you learn about King Philip's War walking around the city of Boston? So I gave some presentations, did some writing on this subject, and one of the presenters in my class was Elizabeth Solomon, who's with the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. And this would be a good time, it is a good time to interject that whether you're at Northeastern or the Westin Hotel, whatever hotel you're in, you are sitting on land that once belonged to this tribe, which is a whole other topic. But I did want to, we should all acknowledge that together, that is the case. So I proposed to Elizabeth that we partner, Northeastern and her tribe, to develop a public program which would consist of a public reading of William Apis's eulogy to King Philip. So where did we get this idea for doing this Apis program? I've been attending a program for the last decade, which inspired me to propose this. It's called Reading Frederick Douglass. And the program consists of a public reading of a tremendous speech by Douglass. And let me take a moment to, it may be that many of you know, but some of you may not. Douglass freed himself from slavery and became a leading abolitionist after the Civil War, an important figure in the Republican Party, which was very different than it is now. And he was one of the greatest orators, in my view, in US history. And his greatest speech was delivered on July 4th, 1852. And the speech was called "The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro." And if you don't know it, I highly recommend you look it up. So the way this program works is that an edited version, because these were great orators, much greater than any orators we have today, but they spoke at great length. So the speech was edited and read aloud by different individuals. Some prominent politicians. This was done right by the Shaw 54th Mass Memorial, which is right by the State House, on the top of Boston Common, right across the street from the State House. So some prominent politicians, some people who are knowledgeable of Douglass, and people passing by, walking by. Multiple copies of the script were available, short passages. It was edited into short passages so that people could read a short section. And that's what was done, has been done every year. The program has expanded across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Some of the key themes in that Douglass speech: the hypocrisy of white Christian America, and the irony and lack of promise that day, the 4th of July, held for people of color. And I would point out to you that the very similar themes were laid out by William Apis on July 4th, 1830, in a speech that he gave in New York City. And it's conceivable, we don't know for sure, but it's conceivable that Douglass encountered Apis's ideas in the 1830s, and then shaped them in his own language, a few decades later. All right. So in undertaking this program on Apus's eulogy, we had to confront the reality that many people, most people, knew little or nothing about Apus, King Philip or Metacom, or King Philip's War. So who was William Apus? He was a Pequot Methodist minister. And according to his one biographer, Drew Lopensina, his was a, quote, stunning and unprecedented voice, not just of Native identity and advocacy, but of rhetorical genius, end quote. He was a key figure in the Mashpee Revolt of 1833. And he delivered the eulogy, which you read an edited version of for today, in 1836 at the Odeon Theater, which no longer stands, but once stood in Boston. So during the King Philip's War, still terribly impacted from the war of the 1630s, and seeking to insulate themselves, protect themselves from further violence, primarily aligned with the English against the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, and the Nipmucs. But in his eulogy, Apus characterizes Philip as a collective indigenous hero, as Christine DeLucia writes in her study. So Lopensina, Drew Lopensina, the biographer, we worked with him. He edited down the text to a reading length of about 40 minutes. And Lopensina termed the eulogy not just a critique of colonialism, but also a scathing indictment of Christianity itself as practiced by a settler nation. And I know that you had that as your assignment. I want to just take just a moment or two because he is such a good writer, and I think it's important to read it. In some of my classes, we read through the whole thing in class, a graduate seminar. So here's just a bit of what Apus says in the eulogy. Does it not appear that the whites have always been the aggressors, and the wars, cruelties, and bloodshed is a job of their own seeking and not the Indians? And he goes on a little later. The spirit of degradation has always been exercised toward us poor and untaught people. If we cannot read, we can see and feel. And we find no excuse in the Bible for Christians conducting toward us as they do. It is said that in the Christian's guide, God is merciful, and they that are his followers are like him. How much mercy do you think has been shown toward Indians, their wives, and their children? Not much, we think. No. And ye fathers, I will appeal to you that are white. Have you any regard for your wives and children, for those delicate sons and daughters? Would you like to see them slain and lain in heaps, and their bodies devoured by the vultures and wild beasts of prey, and their bones bleaching in the sun and air till they molder away or are covered by the falling leaves of the forest and not resist? No. Your hearts would break with grief, and with all the religion and knowledge you have, it would not impede your force to take vengeance upon your foe that had so cruelly conducted thus, although God has forbid you in so doing. For he has said, quote, vengeance is mine, and I will repay, end quote. Our affections for each other are the same as yours. We think of ourselves, we think as much of ourselves as you do of yourselves. Okay, so that gives you just a little bit of the great power of Apus's words. So we secured funding from a state agency called Massachusetts Humanities and a New England organization called the New England Humanities Consortium. And besides Northeastern and the Massachusetts Tribe at Ponkapog, our sponsors included the Institute for New England Native American Studies, which is at University of Massachusetts, Boston, Revolutionary Spaces, which is a coming together of the Old South Meeting House and the Bostonian Society, and the program venue was going to be in Harvard Square, the first parish in Cambridge. And Cambridge happens to be where I live. So I reached out to the city council and worked with them to put together a proclamation for that day, which was one of your reading assignments. So Elizabeth Solomon and I had complementary but different primary motivations to develop this program. For Elizabeth, her primary motivation was she saw this as a way to bring different tribes from across New England together to celebrate and collaborate on this program, public program of reading the eulogy, and to focus on the common Native American heritage it invokes. So she viewed this principally as a means to unify tribes. Of course, not all Native Americans are going to speak with the same voice, true of African Americans, and there are differences, there are disagreements. She saw this as a key way of bridging differences and coming together. For me, my primary goal was to educate as many people as possible about the war and its legacies, plural. And I should note that the venue, First Parish in Cambridge, has a history dating back to the 17th century as an institution, and has an involvement in their past, significant involvement with Christianizing of Native Americans. And they now want to investigate their past in a critical way. So that was a major motivator for them. The format of this program, because we were assuming this lack of familiarity with Apus and the war and King Philip or Metacom, the historical figure, our plan, and the event was scheduled for March 27th, but postponed, and we don't have a rescheduled date yet due to the COVID-19. So our plan was to begin with introductory comments. 15 minutes. This was a difficult order that we asked, and she readily agreed, Lisa Brooks of Amherst College, who is author of a new excellent book, Our Beloved Kin, A New History of King Philip's War. So she was going to provide the setting. Subsequently, we would have readers from different tribes across New England and different ages. Okay, we were really made that a point of emphasis that we wanted to have, and we were lining up undergraduate Native American students who would read the eulogy in short sections, and that we established in the edited text, which you've seen, which you've read. And the evening would have concluded with a panel, including Brooks, Lopensina, a Harvard historian, Philip Deloria, and a Native American historian and activist for decades, Tall Oak Whedon. And I wanted to share with you the summary text that we utilized to promote the event, which is very brief. But it just gives you a sense of how we were promoting this to the general public. In 1675, a native chief who had taken the name King Philip led a rebellion against the British exploitation of New England. The war ended in the enslavement and massacre of native peoples and cast a long shadow over American history. In the 1830s, a native minister named William Apis wrote and delivered in Boston a eulogy for King Philip, meant to celebrate the native past, recall Philip's fight for liberty, and protest the continuing injustices of his present, that is the 1830s. In 2020, Native people from all over New England will come together to honor the memory of these two men and the ongoing struggle to which they gave themselves. So that's what we were using to promote this. Now, at one point in the run-up to the event, I was able to connect with the op-ed editor of the Boston Globe, Marjorie Pritchard. Pritchard, Elizabeth Solomon, Christine DeLucia, and I had a telephone meeting, and Pritchard expressed interest. Actually, this was her idea, and she was putting it out to us, in having her digital staff at the Boston Globe develop an interactive map on the Globe website focused on Native American history and culture. Elizabeth emphasized correctly that the map should not foreground or overemphasize past war and violence against Native Americans, although that might well be part of the effort. And Pritchard was open to the map going beyond after that meeting provided some interesting examples of things that have been done in other places. And she also invited, Pritchard did, Elizabeth to develop an op-ed.
Sorry, Marty, can you hear me?
Yes.
You did break up for a few seconds there, and now you've re-clarified. So can you just repeat the part about Pritchard, what her response was to the question of overemphasis on violence?
She was agreeable that this interactive map would not be something simply that presented Native Americans as victims. So she was agreeable to that, and she invited Elizabeth Solomon to write an op-ed. Well, with the pandemic and the election, the threats to American democracy posed by the sociopath posing as president, so these developments are off the table for now. Hopefully, we can cycle back to them. I'm afraid maybe not any time too soon. And I wanted to note, it's my understanding from Professor Rabinovich that a mapping project is part of your coursework. So you might consider this topic for your work going forward. Building relationships and planning such a program requires considerable effort and time. Sometimes there's conflict. Which is to say, we were in a very good place as March 27th approached, except for this damn pandemic. It was, I will be honest with you, very disappointing when we needed to postpone. But clearly, several hundred people in an indoor venue on March 27th was completely out of the question. For one thing, the venue shut down because of COVID. And we would have been non-compliant with state regulations. And of course, most importantly, we would have been putting ourselves and others at risk. Clearly, COVID-19 has led to many disruptions, small and large, and indeed many deaths, serious illnesses. This was one disruptive moments in our collective lives that we weren't able to do this. So Elizabeth and I, excuse me, met with Mass Humanities staff. You'll remember virtually that they're one of the funders, and we met with them on the scheduled date of the program, which was kind of bittersweet, on March 27th. And one of the staffers, completely in a supportive spirit, raised the idea of, let's do this online. Why not do it online? Everything's online. Here we are online. Elizabeth Solomon was adamantly opposed. She felt and argued that to develop genuine connections among tribes, she saw the need for in-person interactions, that was the only way to really get that done. And I agreed with her and still do. As with theater, and I was president of a theater in Cambridge for a decade, president of the board, it's very different to successfully produce on film, and very difficult, I think, a tremendous challenge to produce on film what is intended as a live, interactive, performative event. And I would say that the film of Hamilton, which many of you may have seen, and I know I did because it was too expensive to go see it on Broadway, maybe the exception. That was great film, and that's probably the exception that proves the rule. We don't know when we're going to be able to. Let me, moving towards wrapping up, I wonder if we could think together for a moment about how and where and what Boston as a community might do on the physical landscape to mark the history of King Philip's War. And I'm going to put two suggestions out there. And then it would be a great segue, I think, to Professor DeLucia to comment on those, comment on anything I said, correct any errors, please. And then we'll get into our conversation and then hear from you. So one possibility, Waterfront Park, which borders the north end of Boston, looks out on Boston Harbor, where, importantly for our purposes, Deer Island is located in Boston Harbor. This is a very popular location when there's not a pandemic. In good weather, it's the place where the boats depart for Boston Harbor Islands. It's right by New England Aquarium. And when you are freer than you are now, or maybe you could, but put on your mask and go down there and take a look. Why not? Okay, so there has been there's a statue there of Christopher Columbus, and there are many statues of Columbus across the United States. This Columbus had nothing to do with the history of Boston. The statue has been vandalized multiple times in the past. After the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter uprising, the statue was beheaded. The city has removed it. By the way, that was one of the few pieces of good news in my as I received it in these days. All right, the city has removed it for now. It has not made, the city of Boston, a decision. Will the head be restored and the statue put back on the pedestal? So what could or should replace it? perhaps something could be installed there, commemorating the history of King Philip's War. Remember, you're looking out, I mean, it's a distance away, but you're looking out on Boston Harbor, that you can see, where you have the Deer Island, location of Deer Island. And then the last possibility I'll raise is Boston Common. And you recall that there were public executions, dozens of Native Americans. But do you think that history is represented in any way on Boston Common? Well, the answer is no, it's not. There are challenges. Right now, the city and the Friends of the Public Garden are currently engaged in a master planning process with respect to Boston Common. Liz Vizza, who is the director of Friends of Public Garden and a colleague and a friend, I have beseeched her in different emails, as a matter of public record, saying, let's do something about King Philip's War here. And her comeback in part, and there's truth to this, is that there's already a lot on the landscape of Boston Common. If you walk around there, which I recommend that you do, there's a lot of statues, and there's the bandstand, and there's fountains, and there's this and that. And going up on the Common is something called the Embrace, which is going to be a tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. It's pretty badly designed public art, a story for another day, but it's going to have a big, overly large footprint on the Common. Still, could something be done? Should something be done on Boston Common is a question. So with that, that's what I have for this part of our program, and I want to turn to